Hello everyone, today we're going to learn how to work this lacy shawl pattern. This is worked with a number of puff stitches and chain stitches together. I've also attached some beads in between to make it look more pretty. For this we need crochet yarn. You need to use thin yarn as long as 2 crochet needles. I'm using one that is 2.5 millimeter to work the pattern, and the second one you need to attach your beads. So you need to make sure your needle is thin enough to get into your bead, and you need some beads as well. So let's get started. We begin this pattern with a slip knot, and then we chain 6. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now you need to work a slip stitch in the first chain that we started with. And then we chain 3, 1, 2, 3. Now we'll start with our first puff stitch. So you yarn over and pull up 5 loops. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Yarn over and finish your puff stitch. Now you chain 2, 1 and 2. Now you work another puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Finish your puff stitch. So now we have 2 puff stitches with chain 2 in between. Now you need to chain 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. Now again you continue with a puff stitch in the ring with 5 loops. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. You finish your puff stitch, chain 2 and you work your last puff stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So we finished our first row. This is what we have, 2 puff stitches with chain 2 in between. After that you work chain 8 and then another puff stitch, chain 2, another puff stitch. So you finish your work, you turn your work, you slip stitch in the first chain space, the first chain 2 space. You make a slip stitch there and you work your puff stitch with 5 loops, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2 and the second puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Now you need to chain 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now you directly go to the chain space in between the 2 puff stitches, your last 2 puff stitches in this chain. You don't work this chain, you skip this and you go to the chain 2 space. Now in that you work your first puff stitch, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2 and your last puff stitch in the same chain space. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So you work 2 puff stitches in your last chain space of the previous row with chain 2 in between. So this is what you have here. Now you turn your work, you slip stitch in the first chain space. You would be doing this in all rows because you need this as your corner. Now you work your puff stitch again, pulling up 5 loops, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2 and another puff stitch in the same chain space. 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now this row we need to chain 16. We started with 8, then 12 and now we need to chain 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, so like we did in the previous row, we need to skip this chain 12 and directly go in the chain 2 space. The last chain 2 space between your puff stitches, and there we need to work 1 puff stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. You finish your first puff stitch, then you chain 2 and you work your next puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Now you turn your work, you slip stitch in the first chain space. This is what we have. Now you start with your first puff stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. And you chain 2, another puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so now in this space we would be working 2 more puff stitches. So now after the first 2 puff stitches we need to chain 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8, and we need to work 2 more puff stitches in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. It's the first puff. Okay, now we chain 2 and you work the last puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So what we've done here is we've worked the first 2 puff stitches with chain 2 in between them. Then we worked chain 8 and then more 2 puff stitches with chain 2 in between them in the same chain space, the first chain space. Now after this you chain 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now you go to the last chain 2 space and work the same pattern. So you need to skip this chain in between, and in the last chain 2 space you work your first puff. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2. Next puff, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now chain 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and your next puff stitch in the same chain space, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2 and your last puff. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So this is what we have here. Now you turn your work. After you turn your work, you need to work a slip stitch in the first chain space, and then you work the same pattern, that is a puff stitch, 3, 4 and 5, and then chain 2 and 1 puff stitch in the same chain space. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. And now we chain 12. So this is a pattern here. So you start with 8, like how we did here. That's 8, 12. Then the next one is 16 and the next one is 12. So whenever we chain, we start with 8 and then 12. The next row is 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. Now we go to the next, we skip this, we go to the next chain space in between the 2 puff stitches. That's right here, this one, and we work a puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now you chain 2, 1, 2, and you work your next puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay. Okay, so this is what we have here. Now we need to bring this together, join this together and add a bead. So you start with chaining 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now what you need to do is you need to put your needle directly under your first chain 8. So in the first row we made chain 8, this one. You need to put your needle directly inside that like this, and then pull up a yarn with all the chains in it. So keep your yarn nice and loose so that your chain can move in between. Okay, now you yarn over and do that one more time. So you insert your needle and pull up a yarn through it. So this is what you have. I'll do that one more time for you. Okay, so you directly put your needle through your last chain. You pull up your yarn through the last chain with all your stitches in between like this. You yarn over and do that one more time. You insert the needle into your last chain. You pull up your yarn through it and pull up a loose yarn so that your chain can move in between. Okay, now you yarn over and pull through all the loops like this. Okay, now you turn your work. Now you have your stitches here. You need to skip this kind of hole and the stitch right next to it. You do not go in this, you go to the chain right next to this one, the first chain next to it, and in that you work a slip stitch. Okay, now this is where we attach a bead. So you pull up your yarn, you take your bead needle, you put that into it. Okay, now you need to put your bead into the needle. All right, so now you yarn over. Now the thread that you pull, you need to pull it through your bead, and then you need to work a slip stitch into the loop that was in your needle. So you work a slip stitch there. Now your bead is attached. Now you work another slip stitch into this stitch. Okay, and then you can change your needle and continue your work. So now you have a bead here. Now you chain 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You turn your work. Now you're left with this puff stitch. So you work in the first chain space. The first chain space. So the first puff, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2. The next puff, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so now this row we need to chain 12. The first one was 8, now it's 12, so chain 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And we go to the last chain space. We need to skip this one. We go to the last chain space and then we work a puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. My needle is making a funny noise. And then we chain 2, 1, 2, and then we work a puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Then you finish your puff stitch. Okay, so this is what we have as of now. We've completed the first one and we've started the next 2 at the sides. So whenever you finish your rows and you go to the 12th, the one that we are doing the 12th chain, you need to make sure to add another puff stitch in the corners, that's here, with chain 8 in between. So that's a pattern to follow. We'll do it one more time. So we need to turn your work, slip stitch, and you work your puff stitches with 5 loops, 4 and 5. Now you chain 2, 1, 2, and the same chain space, another puff stitch, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, so now we finished 8, we finished 12, so the next one is 16. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16. Okay, so we go to the next puff, the chain in between the next puff, and there we continue the pattern, that is a puff stitch. So 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, and chain 2, 1, 2 and another puff stitch in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now we've reached directly above the bead, the row above the bead. So we do not make any chains here. We directly work a puff stitch in the next chain space. So there's no chain in between after the bead. So we work a puff stitch in the next chain space, in the next puff stitch here. So we are working in this space from this space so that you get this pattern. So this is your first puff, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2, your next puff in the same chain space. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, yeah, and now this is the last part. It's similar to this one, the first part here. So we chain 16, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, and then we finish with 2 puff stitches in the last puff space. So that's 1 puff stitch, chain 2 and another puff stitch. I've completed the last 2 puff stitches, and then I've turned my work a slip stitch and then 2 puff stitches with chain in between, which is the same pattern that we follow throughout your entire project. Now we need to work this row, that is 2 puff stitches. So what we've done here is we've chained 8, we've chained 12, and then we've chained 16. So the next one is 12 again. So before that, whenever you chain 12 again in the corner rows, we need to work 4 puff stitches. So that will start another pattern for you, another cluster of chain for you. So we chain 8 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in the same chain space, you work 2 more puff stitches with chain 2 in between. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Chain 2, another puff stitch. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we've started another pattern here with chain 8. Now after this, we need to go to this part and chain 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, and we directly go to this puff stitch. We skip this chain, we go to this puff, and in the chain space between the puff stitches, again we work a puff stitch, 4 and 5, and chain 2, you work another puff stitch in the same chain space, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, now we need to start another pattern here like this. So we need to chain 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, and in the next chain space between the puff stitches, you need to work this pattern. So that is 1 puff stitch. You go in this chain space and you work your first puff stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Chain 2, and in the same space your second puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so we started with a chain 8 in between these two, and then chain 12, and then chain 8 again. Now again we need to work chain 12. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, and you need to go directly in the last chain space and work the same pattern, that is a puff stitch, chain 2, a puff stitch, chain 8, a puff stitch, chain 2, and a puff stitch. So the same pattern in this row, in this chain space. We've completed our row, and I've already worked the first part of our next row, that is the puff stitches with chain 2 in between. Now after this we need to chain 12. We've chained 8 in the previous one, so we chain 12 here. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 and 12. Now you go directly in between the next 2 puff stitches. Now in that chain space you need to work your puff stitch, the first one, 2 3 4 and 5. Okay, and then chain 2, 1 2, and you work your puff stitch in the same chain space, 2 3 4 5. Now after this you chain 4, 1 2 3 4. Now this is a repeat of this stitch that we've done here when we attached the bead. So now you go directly under your chain 8 and you pull up a yarn through that, a good long loop, yarn over, you repeat that again. It should be holding all your chains in between. You yarn over, finish your stitch. Okay, now you turn your work. Alright, now you go in the first chain. You do not go into this hole. In the first chain after that, you go into that and you make a slip stitch. Now you change your needle, you put in the loop, you put your bead in your needle, you have one loop and one bead, you yarn over, you pull the loop through your bead and you work a slip stitch into the first stitch that you had, and then you work another slip stitch. So you yarn over, pull through that stitch. Now you can change the needle, chain 4, 1 2 3 4, you turn your work. Now in the next puff space that you have here, the chain in between, you need to work your puff stitch, 1 2 3 4 and 5, chain 2, another puff stitch, 1 2 3 4 and 5. Okay, now here we have chain 8. In the previous row you chain 12, 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12, and you go to the next puff space. You skip this chain 8, you go to the next chain in between the puff space. That's 1 2 3 4 and 5. Chain 2, another puff stitch, 1 2 3 4 and 5. Okay, so now in this space we work exactly what we've done here to attach the bead. So first we chain 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we go under the chain 8 and pull up a loop. That's your first loop. You yarn over, you go under it again, pull up your second loop. Okay, yarn over, pull through all your loops, you finish your stitch. This is what you have. You turn your work, you slip stitch into the first chain space, not the whole but the first chain that you have here. Okay, you change your needle, you add a bead, you yarn over, you pull through the bead and through the stitch that you have. So you worked your first slip stitch, yarn over, you work another slip stitch, change your needle, chain 4, 3, 4, and then you work your puff stitch here in the chain 2 space. That's your first puff. Okay, so now you will be working chain 2, another puff stitch, and then you need to finish this like how you've done here. So you need to work a chain 12 in between these two. So that will be puff stitch, chain 2, another puff stitch, then you chain 12 above this, and then you finish your row like you've done. I've started my next row with the first 2 puff stitches with chain in between, and I've chained 16 because we've done our 8, then we've done our 12, the next one is 16. Now we need to join this in this puff in between these 2 puff stitches. So we work our first puff, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now you chain 2 and you work your next puff right into that space, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Okay, now you directly go into the next puff because after the bead in the next row there is no chain on top. So you directly go to the next chain space here in between the puff and you join it with a puff stitch. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Chain 2 and the next puff in the same space. Okay, and now again we need to chain 16. So this is the same pattern that you will be continuing till you get this. These are the same chains that are repeating over and over again. So we've completed this 1, 2 and 3 and we've joined this together. That is what we've done here. We've worked this here. Okay, now in the next row we begin the next one. So when you come to the next row, you again start with chain 8 here. In between these 2 puff stitches, you start with chain 8. That is what is different. And as well as in the corner stitches, before you chain 12, after you chain your 16, the next row is chain 12. So in the next row, you always, in the end, you work 4 puff stitches so that you begin this. If you see, you keep beginning the next patterns in the corners and in the center. So that's about it. It is a repeat of the same pattern. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.